The interlocutor speaks. But how can you possibly say that a physical state like being red hot has no causal powers? If a poker is in that state, it obviously has the power to heat or burn things with which it comes into contact. And I reply, yes, but the obvious truth of what you have said doesn't imply that being red hot has the power to heat or burn things. Being red hot doesn't have causal powers, it is a causal power. It is, as you have said, the poker that has the power to heat or burn things. Just as changes of position are motionless and shapes are shapeless, powers are powerless. If these three theses are true, that mental and physical states have no causal powers, that there are no events, that there is no such relation as causation, then it's hard to see how a Kim-style argument for epiphenomenalism, so to describe its conclusion, can even get started. It seems that those who affirm these theses are free to contend that explanatory narratives involving the language of everyday life, the language of everyday life involves mental vocabulary, but also includes many words and phrases that apply to non-sentient and non-sapient objects. Words and phrases like turn, push, lock, bolt, fit exactly into, are by no means falsified or undermined or vitiated by the existence and correctness of God's physical explanations. That is, explanations couched entirely in terms of the interactions among those fundamental physical entities on whose features and arrangement the truth values of the propositions expressed by sentences couched in the language of everyday life supervenes. Mental language does not apply to elementary particles, but neither do words or phrases like turn, push, lock, bolt, and fit exactly into. If the correctness of explanations that contain vocabulary of the latter sort and no mental vocabulary can supervene on the distribution of matter and radiation in space-time, why should it be that the correctness of explanations that involve mental vocabulary cannot also supervene on the distribution of matter and radiation in space-time? I do not pretend to have shown, or even have presented an argument for the conclusion that the correctness of explanations containing mental vocabulary can supervene on the distribution of matter and radiation in space-time. My purpose is only to call into question an argument for the conclusion that this cannot be, or for the conclusion that a substantive philosophical problem confronts those who say that this can be. I would point out, however, that it does seem to be the default position that explanations involving mental vocabulary are sometimes correct. And this default position entails the following conditional. If all truths supervene on the distribution of matter and radiation in space-time, then the correctness of some mental explanations supervenes on the distribution of matter and radiation in space-time. Thank you.
Robin Collins will comment.
Right before I begin my comment on Peter, I would just like to say something about Big Al. I was a student of Big Al's almost 20 years ago now. How many people were students of Al out here? A lot of people. And I just want to thank him for both his unwavering commitment to his Christian faith and his unwavering commitment to intellectual rigor and integrity. I think, as all of us here acknowledge, he's really opened the door for so many of us, including myself, to do what we do in philosophy as both, many of us here, both theists and Christians. And so I'd like to propose a couple of counterfactuals. If Al Plantinga had not existed, there would have been a lot less good Christian and theistic philosophy. And the second counterfactual, if Al Plantinga had not existed, philosophy would have been a greatly diminished profession. So in sum, I would say I feel very fortunate to live in a possible world in which Al Plantinga exists, and that one is actual. Okay, so now on to my comments on Peter's paper. He is giving us many provocative and often counterintuitive theses to think about and consider. So in responding to him, I want to work back. I'm not going to obviously respond to all the theses. I'm going to work back from the end of the paper, which is where the culminating thesis is, to something in the middle of the paper, and make a few comments about that. Peter concludes his paper by claiming that if these three theses are true, that mental and physical states have no causal powers, that there are no events, there is no such relation as causation, then it is hard to see how a Kim-style argument for epiphenomenalism, so to describe its conclusion, can even get started. The problem I have with Peter's statement is that I do not see how a Kim-style argument depends on these theses, and thus why the denial of these theses weakens such an argument. Let me elaborate by presenting one way in which a person could hold that there is a relation of causation and a Kim-style argument fails. In particular, one could adopt a nomenological subsumption account of causation. Under such an account, one could define a state C, or an event C, or whatever you want to call it, as constituting a complete cause of E, if and only if C is temporally prior to E, and two, there is a law such that if C occurs, then E will occur. Further, C and E could be either mental or physical states. Given that these two conditions are satisfied, C and E will have a corresponding relation between them, namely, the relation of being such that one of them is temporally prior to the other, and there is a law requiring that if the state that is temporally prior exists, so does the temporally posterior state. One could then define a causal relation as this relation. Does this notion of cause run into a Kim-style objection? Not necessarily. To see why, consider the regularist view of the laws of nature, in which metaphysically laws merely express universal regularities in the world. In physics, such a law would be expressed by an equation, say Newton's equation of gravity, F equals G m1 m2 over r squared. Thus, under the above account of causation, conjoined with the regularity theory of laws, to say that a physical state is a complete physical cause of another state, E, is merely to say that there is a fundamental equation of physics such that, given some states C existing prior to E, C conjoined with that equation entails E. Now, one can often reformulate the equations in some area of physics in such a way that although the reformulated equations refer to different underlying variables, they entail the same consequences in some relevant subdomain. This means that given the above account of causation, one can give two different complete causal explanations of some occurrence as long as that occurrence can be considered a consequence of the two different fundamental equations. To illustrate this claim, consider classical electromagnetism, that is, non-quantum, non-relativistic electromagnetic theory. In Maxwell's original formulation of the laws of electromagnetism, he formulated his equations using electric and magnetic variables, that is, variables giving the strength and direction of the electric field and magnetic field at each space-time point. So they gave a direction, like an arrow, at every space-time point for both the electric field and the magnetic field. It is well known, however, that one can formulate the laws of classical electromagnetism using electric and magnetic potentials instead of electric and magnetic fields. Although these potentials entail the standard Maxwell's equations of electromagnetism, they are not equivalent to the electric and magnetic field variables. For example, the electric potential is specified by a single number giving the quantity of the potential, so it doesn't have direction, unlike the electric field variable. Whereas the electric field is specified by numbers providing both quantity, strength, and direction. The difference here is analogous to how, when one specifies the mass of an object, one only specifies the quantity of mass, say 1 kilogram, whereas when one specifies the velocity of an object, one must provide both the speed, the quantity of velocity, and the direction, which requires three variables to do, or three numbers to do. In the language of physics, the former is a scalar quantity, and the latter is a vector quantity. Further, the electric and magnetic fields underdetermine the electric and magnetic